Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. So today I am going to be reviewing the TV show Shogun episode 1, and I'm going to be filming my review of episode 2 right after that. So it is April 18th and my sister and I watched episode 1 last night, and we watched episode 2 tonight, and I didn't have time to do my review from last night until tonight. So I'm going to be reviewing Shogun episode 1. So let's get into this. So first of all, this is a real katana that my husband and I have. So it's a real authentic Japanese katana. We have a full set, so we have the katana, the wakizashi, and the tanto. So for those of you who may not know, I'm an author, obviously, if you're watching this channel, and one of my books that I'm actually currently editing, I've got it right here, actually, the printed off version that I'm going through for my editor. It's called Immortal. It's part of my Valiant series. It's a Valiant series prequel, but the character in it is born in like 200 BC, and he lives through 2,000 years of history into modern times. And so some of his history actually does take place in the 1580s Japan during Nobunaga's time, and in later on in the 1860s Japan during the time of the Shinsengumi. So I have done extensive research about this, not just for this book, but just in general, because I really am passionate about this time period of history. So, and I've also have watched one of the historical channels that I like watching here on YouTube is called Metatron, and he did a review of episode 1, so I watched about almost all of his review as of right now of filming, and have checked out a lot of what he had to say about it, because he is a really authentic source of information for a lot of different topics. So he had a lot to say about Shogun as well. So let's get into this review, and I will be giving historical context as well, as well as my opinion as a viewer and an audience and stuff. And this is dangerous. And this is also a example of a Japanese kimono. I can't really get a good angle of it, but I got it at the Renaissance Fair a couple years ago. So anyways, so my review. So I honestly loved it. I can't even express to you how much I love this. So I haven't ever really seen a really good authentic TV series that revolved around this time period that was live action ever. I got into Japanese and samurai and stuff like that because of the TV show Hakoiki, which follows the Shinsengumi in the 1860s, and then I eventually got into samurai warriors and samurai warriors empires, which revolves around Nobunaga and Hideyoshi and Ieyasu Tokugawa and a lot of those guys. So that's what interested me in this time period, and then I wrote this book, my book Immortal, which features this time period and the other one. And I have a book over there on my shelf, which is all about the samurai, and it goes through a lot of the details about it. So I learned a lot from that, and then my own research after the fact. So the TV show Shogun is based off of a novel. I'll pop it up here on the screen, which I'm hoping to read and review sometime if I can get a hold of it. But anyways, so it's a TV show based on the novel, and at one time the novel actually was a TV show back in the 80s. So I don't know how much they're basing, it's just off the novel. So what the novel does is it changes the names, but the people, the characters, the people that they're supposed to represent are the same, are basically who they are. For example, one of the main guys, his name is, it starts with a T. But the main guy, I'll pop up his picture here on the screen. He is meant to represent Tokugawa Ieyasu. And at the time, I didn't know this. When we first watched episode 1 last night, I didn't know it was based on a book. I didn't know anything about what the show was other than the time period, which it takes place in 1600. So all throughout episode 1, I was like, that sounds like Tokugawa. That sounds like Tokugawa Ieyasu. I was like, that sounds like Ieyasu. And there were a lot of different details that sounded like it. And I was like, but his name was different. And I was like, okay, just similar, I guess. But I kind of called it in a way because a lot of the history was the same as Tokugawa Ieyasu. And so it was cool to find out that it was based on a novel, and that character was inspired by Tokugawa. So it's pretty much a one-to-one, the same thing as Tokugawa, the real Tokugawa Ieyasu. Along with that, they mention that the death of the basically the Shogun, but they use a different term. I can't remember the exact term. I have a horrible memory. If I do, I'll pop it up here on the screen. But the death of the leader, the Shogun, essentially, and they kept referencing he has a young heir, so he just died. It's 1600. He had an heir. He installed a council of regents to help transition his heir to power and make sure his heir stayed in power. And I was like, that is pretty much what happened to Hideyoshi, but they never name any names. But I am 100% certain, now that I know that it's based on a novel and the characters are inspired by real life characters, I'm 100% certain that the person who died was Hideyoshi Hashiba, who is also another character in my book that I do include in my book. But he was a real guy, and what I love, I'm so scatterbrained, but I loved the mention of the council in episode 1, and I was so excited, not knowing what was going to happen in episode 2, which I'll get to in my next review. But when the guy who's meant to represent Ieyasu Tokugawa, he comes in to meet with the council, and it reminded me of how the history behind Hideyoshi's death and how he installed the council to make sure that his son would stay in power and to protect his son. So first of all, the costumes, the armor, the weapons, everything looks good. Everything looks authentic and historically accurate. And I loved when you see the samurai coming into the ships, or getting ready to get to the ship that crashed there. Some of them, you have archers, you have some of them wielding arquebuses, because a lot of people don't think that Japanese people used guns in the samurai golden era at this time, but they actually did. And Nobunaga was one of the first to increment arquebuses in combat in a big kind of fashion, and he utilized that a lot in his warfare before he died. So it was nice to see the archers, the arquebuses, the armor, and the armor set is so authentic and cool. I love all of the headpiece, the helmets and the headpieces and the shape that they have on there. When Tokugawa rides into Osaka, first of all, the city, it looked really good. The castle, all of the sets, it all looked so good. And there were so many little authentic details. At one shot you can see multiple walls, which was a Japanese thing that they did to hinder enemies coming in and sieging them. But Tokugawa, the flags that they rode alongside, I'll show a picture here if I can find one, in the show actually used the real life symbol of the Tokugawa family. So that was a nice little thing. And one thing that I did question was, I know that at one time they had banned beards, other than if you were a lord you could have a beard, and so a beard for them signified somebody of importance. And I noticed a lot of the unimportant guys, some of them were wearing beards too. And when I was watching Metatron's video, which I'll have a link to the description of that in below so you guys can watch it, because he goes so much more in depth than me, and I love watching his videos. But he had talked about how the beard rule, about how samurai had to be clean shaven, didn't come about as a law until later on. So that was more like the Edo period kind of. And so at this period, the Sendoku period, I think is what it's called, it was still some samurai had beards, some didn't. Same with the top knot and how they would have the middle of their head shaven. Some guys actually did keep a full head of hair until that became an official ruling later on. And that also goes for the way that they sat. So in the council meeting, all of the regents were sitting cross-legged, and I was kind of wondering why they weren't sitting in Seiza, but Seiza actually came about as a ruling later on. So until then it was the rulers were sitting cross-legged and kind of comfortable. And then you could also see some of the guys in the background. I'll put a picture here if I can find one. They would sit in a certain way where they could easily get up on their right knee first, because their weapons would be on their left hip. And so if you're going to get up with your left leg, you would inhibit being able to reach your weapon. And so you'd want to be able to draw your weapon. And so that's why you would get up on your right side first. And that's even a cultural thing with Japanese people, as far as I'm aware. So the other tidbit that I personally noticed without even watching, because some of these other details I've learned from Metatron's video, but one detail that I noticed besides the way that they were sitting was the fact that there was a scene where Tokugawa Ieyasu, removes his katana and leaves his wakizashi. And in my research, that actually is a thing, that when you're going to important meetings, it was actually forbidden to draw your blade or have a blade in front of an important leader or lord. And but at the same time, samurai would never ever go anywhere weaponless, so that's why they would keep their wakizashis on them, because they're a little bit smaller, they're not as cumbersome, and they would still have a form of protection while not also being offensive by wearing one of these in front of the lord, which is also, again, they're big and cumbersome. It was easier to wear wakizashis indoors, so a lot of times they would remove the katanas. I'm hitting stuff. They would remove their katanas and only have their wakizashis on them. So that was another detail that I thought was really, really cool. So in the meeting, there's a lot of, first of all, the way that the show handled the way the Japanese politics is like a whole nother, like, we all love the drama and the politics of medieval like times, and like there's shows like Reign and Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a fantasy world, but it's still based on like medieval politics. Reign is very much like it's 1500s England and France, really, and so medieval politics is something we all kind of love. That's why like medieval fantasy and other books like that are so popular. Japanese politics is a whole nother level of politics, because there's this subtle way where like there's a double meaning to everything that they say, and they're so polite and formal, but you have to like read between the lines and really understand the way that the Japanese people at the time kind of handle their politics and the different rules and cultural things. And it's just so fascinating to see something so authentic when they handled this meeting and everything. And one of the things that happens is that first of all, one of the names that I recognized was Ishido, and it reminded me of Ishida, which is another character or historical figure that I recognized from the time period, and I also recognized him from the Samurai Warrior Empires games. So I really loved getting to see Ishida, and again, his name is Ishido in the show, but it's basically reflecting the main character. And so a lot of times when I talk about names, I'm referring to the Japanese names of the real historical figures they're supposed to be representing, because I can't remember the character names very easily yet. I haven't watched the show enough to like really get their names in my head, so you'll have to forgive me for referring to them as their actual, who they're inspired by. But Ishido/Ishida, and so he says something, and it's kind of like insulting to Tokugawa. I don't remember the exact wording, but basically one of Tokugawa's retainers is sitting in the door, and he draws his blade, and he confronts Ishida about insulting his lord, aka Tokugawa. And as soon as he did that, I was like, oh no, because you do not draw your blade. Like that was, you don't draw your blade in front of a lord or someone of high importance. So that was the death sentence as soon as he drew his blade. And he had to have known that. But so when he's confronted about offending Ishida, he bows and basically offers to commit seppuku, which at the time would also mean that his whole family line would be killed along with him. And it was really tragic and heartbreaking. It was kind of awkward because he should have known that that's what would happen, but I think that they worded it that way to explain it for the audience, which is a writer's trick. Like, if you need to explain something instead of info dumping, you can have a character say it, as long as it's not too awkward or out of place. It wasn't like that big of a deal, but it just was kind of a tidbit to kind of explain what was going on and what would be required of him, even though logically like he would have known what was required of him. But that was a little tidbit. And so that side of the things, there's this whole plot line with him and how he wants to take his son, and his wife doesn't want to give his son up, obviously, because that's her son. But in the end, it actually does imply that he does commit seppuku and he does kill his son, and like the wife is ordered to live and she doesn't want to. And it's very tragic, but it's like a very Japanese, like at the time, like that was how things were done, and he should have known better than to speak out. So it was really stupid of him to do that. But again, when you insult a samurai's lord, like his honor and pride is going to make him want to say something or do something. But again, that's going to get you killed. And so it was just this really, really, really interesting and intriguing plot lines and details about the Japanese culture and the politics going back and forth. And the whole story is about this English guy on a Portuguese ship or a Dutch ship or something. And they crash land here and he gets captured. And he's very, so the only thing that I didn't like was he's very vulgar and kind of mouthy, but I think that's probably more to do with his character from the book and, you know, who he was based off of in real life, which is William something. I can't remember the exact name, but he was based off of a real life character as well. And so that, and then there was some nudity, like I think they showed his butt at one point, and so I didn't really like that. And I think there was one sex scene we had to skip, but that may have been, I don't remember, but there was basically a spicy scene, and that scene that we had to skip over. So I didn't like that, but the drama between the Catholics and the Protestants is also really cool. I don't know much about Portugal and Spain at this time, other than I know that England, he mentions in episode 2, the main guy, John, something. I can't remember his name. I'm terrible with names. I'm sorry. I can't remember crap anymore. He does mention a queen, and so I looked it up and I was like, that's Queen Elizabeth I, from which was, we watched the show Reign. That was during her time period. So this time she was still alive. So I thought that was a nice little historical tidbit too. So I don't know much about Spain and Portugal at the time other than the religious war between the Catholics and the Protestants, and they really bring that out as well. And so the authenticity of the historical and the cultural stuff in the show, it is so accurate and so authentic, and I love the costumes and the armor and the swords and like the sets and everything is just so historically accurate. And I love, and it's also very gritty, and it doesn't show that whole the romanticized version of samurai and Japan and culture, the Japanese culture. They don't like romanticize anything, and it's like very authentic and historical, and that's what I really like. And it's also very gritty, so not only is it all historical and from one of my favorite time periods of history, but it's also very gritty and realistic, and I'm really into the show. So honestly, I really, other than the nudity, I don't have any complaints. And the nudity for me is one thing that would knock it down to 4 stars, but it's just so good that I still have to give it a 5-star rating. Okay, sorry I'm out of costume. This is future Joanna here. I just wanted to make a few extra notes that I forgot to mention in my review. So number 1 is I've seen a lot of comments from people who are actually Japanese people watching the show, and some of them said that some of the Japanese they didn't even understand and had to read the captions to understand, because what they've done such a good job at the show is that the Japanese used is an older form of Japanese that isn't really used anymore, and it would be the equivalent of like older English, like if we tried to understand Shakespeare, for example. And they do have a formal way of speaking. Even the English, there's several times that they're meant to be Portuguese, but they're speaking English, and there's several different older words that I did pick up on in there. And so the Japanese, the version of it is an authentic Japanese used from that time period, and they did have like dialogue coaches and voice coaches, language coaches working on them with that. And one of the other things that I forgot to also mention that did strike me, it was one scene where the main character, and his name is, I think, John Blackthorne, but Blackthorne is his last name. He's arguing with one of a Jesuit priest, and the Jesuit priest is translating what he's saying to one of the Japanese leaders wrong, incorrectly. So he's getting mad, and of course the Jesuit priest is like a Catholic Jesuit priest or whatever, and so they're enemies. And Blackthorne grabs the priest's like wooden cross and throws it into the ground, and that struck me as odd and a little bit inauthentic, because I don't think any Christian, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, would ever throw a cross on the ground. And in Metatron's video, he talks about this more in depth, how later on after the 1620s, there is a Christian rebellion, and then Christianity is kind of banned again, and the Japanese authorities at the time would force Christians to throw any type of imagery about Christ or even Mary on the ground. And some Christians would refuse and get tortured and executed for it, but that was them being forced to, and that was later on when the persecution really started in, and that was not at this time period. And he didn't do it because he was forced, he did it because he was angry. And I get that the guy is kind of a vulgar character who has a lot of anger issues, and he's really barbaric and rude, and they do portray that, and it fits his character that they've built. But it seemed a little odd that even if he was angry, he's still supposed to be a Protestant, and even a Protestant wouldn't really throw a cross down on the ground like that. But it wasn't enough to like bother me, other than just it seemed a little odd for the character. So that was the things that I wanted to add, and that I didn't want to forget. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this review. What do you guys think of Shogun and the show? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys and hear what you guys think, because it's a really good show. And in the meantime, if you liked this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more writing and reading videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And in the meantime, if you liked my review of this show and this episode, stay tuned, because I'm going to be reviewing episode 2 next week, so stay tuned for that.